Well, hello. Welcome back. This workshop is going to cover hooks in state and React, which is basically a way that we can make our components really interactive. We're going to continue from the previous section. If you're not sure if you have the right code, we have a checkpoint for you, so don't worry about that at all, but let's get started. So this is not a very good tweet because we can't like it. So I agree, but I want to show some support. So how can we do that? Well, before we actually implement the functionality, I always like adding first just a little wireframe of what we want this to look like. So let's add, maybe a few tags that kind of just add what a stereotypical like button might look like. And again, this workshop's not really about making the best looking app, so don't kind of stress about that. So we want something like this, where if we hit this +1 button, right, the number of likes is going to go up. So how do we do that? We're going to do that with this function and this type of thinking in React called state. So state basically should contain all the information that that component needs to know about itself. And in this case, that's the number of likes that the tweet has. You might be asking, why can't we just use a simple variable to do this? Well, think about what we actually need to do if we want to code this in real life, right? Without React, we have to say, okay, let's keep a variable. Every time the variable changes, we need to somehow update the screen. If you have a really complex app like a dashboard, this can get super complicated very quickly. So React handles all of this for us with this thing called state. So let's get started. First, we're going to import this thing called useState. And this is what we call a hook. Not super important to know exactly why it's called a hook, but this is basically just importing this function called useState that we're going to use. Next, in the tweet, doesn't really matter exactly where we put it, so I'm just going to put it here to be consistent with the tutorial, is we're going to do this line that I'll explain in a moment. So what's going on here? First, it seems pretty obvious that useState, it must be a function because we're calling it and we're passing in an argument. So what are we passing in? This value we pass in is the default value for the state. So in this case, I think tweets probably should start with 0 likes. Later, if you have a database or a backend, this number might change, but we can kind of deal with that another time. So what's going on the left here? This is a little weird, and you may have not seen syntax like this if you haven't used languages like JavaScript before. So what this basically says is, hey, useState is going to return an array. And I know that. If you don't know that, it's kind of unfair. How would you? But this basically says, let's make 2 variables. One is called likes. Likes is going to be the first element in the array, and the second is going to be called setLikes, and that's going to be the second element in the array. Okay, but what actually are likes and setLikes? Well, when you use the useState function, it returns to you an array with 2 things. The first item, which we'll call the likes, is the current value of the state variable. This is different from the default value, right? Because it might change. The second is a function that we'll use to update the state. And we need to make sure that we always tell React every time we update the state function so it knows to update everything that relies on it. Okay, so hopefully that made a little bit of sense. Let's actually get used to using this. First, I want to quickly write a function that increments the likes, right? And you might say, oh, but this is not that hard. But I think this is pretty good practice. And also, as your app becomes more complex, creating small functions like this is actually really useful. So here, all this add likes function is going to do is it's going to take likes, it's going to add 1, it's going to pass that to setLikes. And so now we've kind of learned that setLikes is a function, as I mentioned earlier. And what setLikes does is whatever thing you pass in will be the new value of likes. Make sense so far? If you haven't seen this syntax before, this is called an arrow function. We're not going to stress too much about how it works or the internals of it, but I'm going to be writing a lot of functions like this. But yeah, so the next question is, okay, I want to use both of these things. We're not using likes at all, and we're not using add likes at all. First, let's render likes. This is pretty simple. Likes is just another variable. So I can use my braces, I can type in likes, and ta-da, it works as intended. As we'll see as the page refreshes, the number of likes is now 0. Okay, so now what we want to do is every time we click the button, right, we want this number to go up. How do we do that? Well, in normal JavaScript, we can use something that the button has called an onClick listener, and you can pass in a function. But we're going to do it in React, and they do something very similar. Basically, we type in onClick. Notice that there's a capital for the C. And then here, what we can do is we can pass in a function that should get called every single time the button gets clicked. And I want to point out here that we're not calling the function. If we call the function, this is going to evaluate to what this function returns, which is nothing. This function doesn't return anything. But if we don't use the parentheses, then we're saying, oh, don't pass in the return value of add likes, pass in add likes itself. And we're going to be doing this, passing functions as arguments to other functions all the time in React. So you want to try to get used to this or wrap your head around it. Yeah, so if I save now and give this a shot, where the React app will refresh, and look at that. When we press the button, the number of likes goes up. And you might say, wow, this was kind of complicated to make a working button and counter work. And you might be right. But as your app becomes more and more complex, and as we'll see when we add multiple components with multiple states, abstractions like state make it really easy for us to write clean web apps. So as a quick recap, what did we talk about today? We talked about the idea of state, about everything that the component needs to know. We imported the state hook. We called useState and talked about what its arguments and return values are. We wrote our own little micro function to update our state variable. And then we both rendered the state variable, and we also added an on-click listener that calls our micro function. And that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about how you can make your app even more awesome. See you then.